Hey guys, tonight we slip past the guards and into the velvet shadows of the royal chambers, where candlelight dances on bare skin and secrets drip like honey. The air is thick with rosewater, sweat, and something unsaid. Just beyond the carved oak doors, the queen waits, adorned in gold, untouched. But inside, the king isn't on his throne. He's tangled in whispers and silk sheets with someone nameless, someone history will never acknowledge, who may command the fate of a kingdom by morning, with a breath, a touch, a lie. If this kind of sleepy storytelling is your thing, hit like and subscribe. It's free, and you can always unsubscribe if you change your mind. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I always love seeing who's drifting off across the world. And now, hush. The palace is waiting. Let's sneak into history. You tiptoe through the hush of twilight, trailing your fingers along the velvet walls, following the soft sounds of laughter that doesn't quite belong to royalty. It's not a queen's voice, that much is clear. It's lighter, younger, edged with a hint of nerves. Someone is trying very hard to sound relaxed. I'll picture this. The year is 1534, and you're at the French court. King Francis the Borms is entertaining not his queen, Eleanor of Austria, but a woman named Anne de Pisseleu. She's witty, cultured, and entirely unelected. And yet tonight, she will be more powerful than any nobleman in the chamber. She's his mistress, and not just for pleasure. She shapes his opinions, his moods, his policies. And the queen? She's likely saying her prayers, miles away in another wing of the palace. It's not just France. Slide quietly across the channel to Tudor England, and you'll find Henry VIII, a man who turned the throne into a carousel of mistresses, courtiers, and fleeting affection. Some he married, most he didn't, and many were plucked straight from the servant class. One evening they're pouring wine, the next they're being gifted estates. Historians still argue whether this behavior was about loneliness, lust, or politics, but the pattern is unmistakable. Queens were there to provide heirs. Servants were there to provide everything else. You watch, curled up behind a heavy tapestry, as a servant girl lowers her eyes and pours wine just a little too slowly, her sleeve brushing the king's wrist. Is it an accident? Not likely. She's learned that little gestures open doors, and she doesn't need to be beautiful. Just present, just available, just safe. Queens were dangerous. They had families, alliances, and ambitions. But this girl, she has no father to write angry letters, no army waiting to defend her honor. That, oddly enough, makes her perfect. The queen, for all her jewels, was rarely welcome in the king's private space. Royal marriages were arranged before the couple ever met. Love wasn't the point. Trade routes were. So when night fell, many kings preferred a warm body who didn't come with a dowry and a dozen political treaties. It's late now. The fire's dimmed. The king reclines with his boots off, laughing low and lazy. You watch as he leans toward the servant, voice dropping. She giggles, too loudly maybe, and the chamberlain quietly steps out, shutting the door behind him. No records will show what happens next. No historian will write her name. But for tonight, she holds more sway than any royal document. Centuries later, in a dusty archive in Bavaria, a letter is discovered. It's unsigned, unsent, and unaddressed. A woman's hand, elegant but hesitant, confesses to feeling both cherished and erased. He looks through me, and still he beckons. She writes, "Was she a maid? A tutor? A nursemaid who got too close? We'll never know. But the tone is familiar. These women walked a strange line. Adored, ignored, touched, silenced. A fringe tidbit. In the Ottoman court, women of the harem were deliberately kept illiterate, not because knowledge was frowned upon, but because reading and writing could create political power. One learned concubine once smuggled letters to a neighboring prince, letters that nearly launched a war. You slide deeper into the shadows now and the voices fade. The queen still waits. Maybe she's praying. Maybe she's pacing. Maybe she's sleeping with her back to a cold wall. Her crown doesn't grant her entry here. Her title doesn't open that door. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, the servant girl might be dismissed. Or she might be rewarded with pearls. Or a small cottage. Or nothing at all. She knows better than to expect more. But for now, she's warm. She's seen. And oddly, she holds the night. Funny how history works. Queens wore the jewels, but servants wrote the secrets. The flicker of dawn creeps across the high stone windows now, and still the queen lies untouched in her linen-draped bed. You sit with her for a moment, not out of pity, but to understand. Her chamber smells of lavender and sanctity. Her gown is embroidered with threads of real gold, and yet she might as well be cloaked in air. She is a queen in name, not in heart. You notice her hands, soft, idle, clasped on her lap. These are not hands meant for passion or command. They are ceremonial, kissed by nobles, waved from balconies, pressed together in prayer. They hold no power in the place that matters most to a king's whims, his bedchamber. Marriage among monarchs was rarely about affection. No candles burned for love at the wedding feast. These unions were cold contracts, alliances sealed not with hearts, but with maps. When Louis XVI married Marie Antoinette, neither spoke the other's language. And on their wedding night, nothing happened. Not for 7 years. Meanwhile, courtiers and gossips played out the implications like a chessboard. Without an heir, the alliance between Austria and France felt weak, brittle, like porcelain too fine for everyday use. You wonder what it must feel like to be a queen who cannot even tempt her husband. A queen with castles, but no warmth. History doesn't record how often their pillows were wet with tears, but you can guess. So where did kings turn, if not to their glittering wives? Often to someone simpler, someone pliable, someone lower. It wasn't always about seduction. Sometimes it was about ease. The servant didn't ask questions. She didn't quote scripture or demand heirs. She smiled when asked. She left when dismissed. Her silence was as useful as her touch. There's something oddly modern about it, isn't there? The king with his trophy wife on paper, and someone entirely different in practice. A pattern older than gossip, baked into the mortar of every palace. But queens weren't always docile. Some noticed, some rebelled, and some accepted their fate with an elegance so sharp it could cut marble. Take Catherine of Aragon, Henry VIII's first queen. She was royal in every way, devout, educated, born of powerful Spanish blood. But Henry set her aside when she couldn't bear a surviving son. He wanted Anne Boleyn, clever, teasing Anne who refused to be just a mistress. Catherine refused to step down. She declared herself queen until her dying breath. She lost her throne, her husband, her place in court, but not her dignity. Historians still argue whether she was brave or simply stubborn, but she never bowed. Others were more practical. You tiptoe into the late 1700s, into the stifling court of Prussia. Queen Elizabeth Christine, wife to Frederick the Great, was so thoroughly ignored that entire seasons passed without her husband visiting. But she didn't fight. She retreated into books, gardens, music. She played the perfect invisible spouse, and she survived. Quiet survival was its own kind of power, and some queens, fascinatingly, thrived in these cold arrangements. They made their own alliances, forged friendships, even took quiet lovers of their own. But they had to be discreet. One wrong look, one ill-timed letter, and a queen's flirtation became treason. Did you know that in the Spanish court of Philip IV, Queen Elizabeth of France was rumored to have shared long walks and soft exchanges with a young courtier named the Duke of Medina? Nothing proven, of course. Nothing written. But their footsteps in the garden were seen too often. Their laughter was just a little too real. And yet, her name remains. Not because of scandal, but because she navigated the storm without capsizing. A queen, unseen and unforgettable. Here's a quirky nugget. In some medieval courts, queens were literally not expected to speak at dinner. Only the king's guests could speak. The queen, even in her own home, was ornamental, a moving part in a royal painting. You imagine sitting through every feast in silence, nodding and smiling while others told stories, laughed, argued. You're not just bored, you're invisible. And invisibility over years grows bitter. Back in the present, the image of a silent queen is haunting, isn't it? Draped in jewels, glowing in candlelight, but slowly fading in relevance, while her husband shares jokes and secrets with the seamstress or the milkmaid. Of course, not all kings preferred this. Some were genuinely close to their queens, but they were exceptions, not norms. Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, for instance, had a famously deep bond. But even that intimacy was punctuated by protocol, by layers of duty that separated even the most affectionate couples. So you lie back, letting the strange sadness of it all soak in, that these women, born into the highest positions on earth, were often denied the simplest human warmth. No hand to hold in the dark, no real voice in their own marriage, no choice. Power didn't always come with pleasure. Sometimes it came with a cold bed and a crown that never felt quite real. You drift now through long corridors lined with velvet tapestries and worn stone floors, and you realize something strange. The most powerful room in the palace isn't the throne room. It's the bedchamber. Not the queen's, of course, the king's. And who had access to that chamber? Who was allowed past the guards, past the formal courtiers, past even the royal children? Servants, not generals, not dukes, not even most advisors, but a cupbearer could enter while the king dressed. A valet could whisper into his ear while helping him out of his boots. And sometimes, with nothing but warm hands and lowered eyes, a maid could change the mood of an entire morning. You settle into a little stool in the corner of one such chamber, not seen but listening. The king speaks low, relaxed. He's not talking about taxes or treaties. He's asking about the stew from dinner. He's chuckling about the way the duchess tripped on her hem. And the servant, a man this time, perhaps his barber or stable hand, replies with just enough wit to make him laugh again. See, being close to the king physically often meant being close to him emotionally. And from there, a clever servant could become an advisor in all but name. Historians still argue whether these relationships were truly influential or just background noise. But when you hear about entire laws written after a servant casually mentioned something, you start to wonder. In Louis XIV's court, the king's personal valet was so influential, he earned the nickname the Silent Minister. One raised eyebrow from him, and the nobility flinched. Imagine having that power while carrying someone else's dressing robe. In England, George III's favorite page was quietly given access to documents before the actual prime minister. Why? Because he was already there, in the room. The prime minister needed a formal audience. The page needed only to wait for the king to finish brushing his teeth. And sometimes the line between servant and lover was paper thin. That's what made it so potent. No one knew where influence stopped and intimacy began. The two often blurred in whispered exchanges and glances behind chamber doors. You might be picturing the king as some cold-blooded manipulator, but it wasn't always that simple. Power is lonely. You wear a crown, and suddenly everyone wants something, except perhaps the servant who has nothing to gain, or so it seems. That illusion made kings feel safe, and safety made them generous. Sometimes foolishly so. A fringe tidbit. In the Russian imperial court, Catherine the Great's personal attendant was known to hide letters from rival courtiers and occasionally forged her signature just to keep things running smoothly. It worked. She trusted him more than her ministers. But not every servant was content to remain in the shadows. Some played the long game. They began as chamberlains and ended as dukes. Others used gossip as currency. They heard everything. And in the palace, information was more valuable than gold. You didn't need a sword to fight a war. You just needed to know who was sleeping with whom, who was drinking too much, who muttered treason in their sleep. You glide along the floor now, like smoke, past quiet rooms where these games unfolded. A whispered suggestion here, a harmless confession there. Power changes hands in silence, and kings, well, they liked soft voices. There's one moment you stumble upon. A young servant girl in an Austrian palace, perhaps 16, whispering to the Archduke about the noblewoman who insulted his hunting dog. It's innocent, right? Just gossip. But 2 days later, that noblewoman is reassigned to Hungary. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe the girl understood the art of planting ideas without making it look like treason. Some of these servants were barely literate. Some couldn't write their own names. And yet, they could read a king's mood better than any advisor. They knew when he needed distraction, when he needed flattery, when he needed truth. That intuition, not taught in schools, made them dangerous. One servant, a mute boy in the court of Charles II of Spain, became infamous for his ability to read lips and mimic expressions. He communicated through gestures alone, yet was suspected of passing information between rivals for years. The king reportedly kept him at his side at all hours, as if he were a charm, a pet, or maybe the only soul he trusted. You lean back now, blinking slowly, letting the truth settle. Kings were never truly alone. Not when someone helped them undress, not when someone changed their sheets, and not when someone leaned close to whisper the last thing they'd hear before sleep. It's funny. The servant's face would never appear on coins. Their names are barely scratched into the margins of dusty journals, but their hands lit the candles, stirred the medicine, buttoned the collar, soothed the fever. When the king cried in the middle of the night, it wasn't the queen he called for, it was them. In a world obsessed with bloodlines and birthrights, these low-born attendants held the most intimate space of all. Not by force, not by law, but by presence. Quiet, steady, dangerous presence. And when that presence came with soft words and a steady gaze, sometimes it became love, or something close enough to pretend. You're back inside the palace walls tonight, curled up in a velvet alcove just behind the golden lattice of a royal music room. The air is warm with candle wax and perfume, and from here, you can see her. Not the queen, but her. No title, no crown, no royal seal, just flushed cheeks, a whisper of satin, and a laugh like falling water. She doesn't speak loudly, but everyone listens when she does, including the king. This is the royal mistress. No, not a scandalous secret. Not hidden, not ashamed. Official, adored, appointed. Mistresses weren't always accidents of lust or folly. Sometimes they were positions of strategy, as real and influential as a prime minister. Some had homes gifted by the crown, entire staffs of their own, and were addressed with more reverence than the queen herself. Why? Because the king listened to them, and more dangerously, he believed them. You slide closer in your imagination into Versailles in the 1740s. The court is humming with music and powdered wigs, but the true center of gravity isn't King Louis XVII, it's Madame de Pompadour. She's elegant, yes, but more than that, she's clever. She recommends artists. She reads philosophy. She speaks with foreign envoys before they're even summoned by ministers, all while lying back in a silk chaise, nibbling candied violets. Historians still argue whether Madame de Pompadour had true political power or whether she simply influenced a man who did. But the effect was the same. France shifted around her laughter. The queen at the time? Poor Marie Leszczyńska, kind and forgotten, lived in another wing, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting and books she never finished. She reportedly accepted Pompadour's presence with grace, but not joy. Can you blame her? Here's the irony. The mistress had no legal standing, no rights, no formal acknowledgement in court hierarchy. She could be dismissed in a heartbeat, her fortunes crumbling like burnt pastry. And yet, while she reigned, her word bent courtiers into bows. Her enemies smiled through gritted teeth. Even ambassadors waited for her nod. A fringe tidbit. In 17th century England, Charles II's mistress Nell Gwyn was so publicly accepted that when a crowd mistook her for a rival, she stuck her head out of her carriage and shouted, "I am the Protestant whore." The crowd cheered. She wasn't royalty. She was beloved. You tiptoe through the annals of history and find this pattern again and again. Powerful women without titles. They weren't queens, but they were close to the king. Too close to ignore. Close enough to influence. Never close enough to rule. A dangerous balance. Take Diane de Poitiers, mistress of Henry II of France. She was nearly 20 years older than him. Scandalous by today's standards, let alone theirs. But he trusted her more than his ministers. She signed royal edicts. She helped design palaces. He wore her colors in battle. And when he died, the queen, Catherine de' Medici, finally got her revenge. Diane was exiled, her lands stripped, but not forgotten. Diane may have fallen from grace, but for decades she was more powerful than the crown on Catherine's head. And you can't help but wonder, how much did that sting? Because queens, despite all their grandeur, were trapped in roles they didn't choose. Born into duty, married off like chess pieces, watched from the moment they bled, their bodies scrutinized for signs of fertility. But mistresses, they chose, they played. They could walk away or seduce their way to unimaginable heights. Sometimes queens fought back. Sometimes they schemed right alongside the mistresses, each trying to outmaneuver the other in a palace cold war of side eyes and silent dinners. But other times, the queen simply vanished into ritual. Morning prayers, charity visits, embroidery circles that never ended. Meanwhile, in the king's solar, the mistress tasted his wine, advised on appointments, and whispered names he would soon promote or destroy. It's hard not to feel sympathy for the queens, but it's also hard not to admire the mistresses. They had no shields, no armies, no official power, and yet They shaped policy through pillow talk and patience. And don't think for a moment that these relationships were always about sex. Some of the most influential mistresses were past their prime by court standards. What they had was charm, presence, the ability to make a man feel seen even if he wore a crown. You rest your head against a tapestry now, hearing their laughter echo through time. The mistresses were not saints. They weren't villains either. They were survivors, navigators of a cruel, glittering world. The palace was a stage, and they knew how to act, or rather, how not to act. One wrong expression, and they'd be accused of witchcraft. One bold statement, and they'd be called a temptress. So they smiled, listened, suggested, never ordered, but still they ruled. And if you think that's over now, if you think only history held such strange dualities, think again. Influence has always danced just outside the spotlight. So tonight, as you lie still, picture her again. The woman in lavender, feet tucked beneath her, a glass of sherry untouched. The king leans toward her, enchanted, uncertain. The crown may rest on his head, but the night belongs to her. The doors creak softly tonight as you slip into a darker wing of the palace. Colder, quieter, heavy with the weight of disuse. No music, no laughter, just a hush that hangs thick in the air, like a room that's forgotten how to breathe. This is where queens are sent when they stop being useful. You pad gently across the stone floor and stop in front of a heavy wooden door, reinforced with brass. No one speaks here. Behind this door, a queen is kept. Not quite prisoner, not quite free. She wasn't caught in scandal. She didn't betray the crown. She simply stopped being necessary. This happens more often than you'd think. A queen who fails to produce an heir? She's a liability. A queen who gains too much affection from the people? She's a threat. A queen who refuses to be silent? She's dangerous. So she's tucked away. Politely, of course. Respectfully. Always with decorum, but quietly. Erased. You settle in beside the door, where a crack in the stone lets in a soft draft. Inside, the queen is reading. Alone. No ladies in waiting tonight. No music from the court below. Just her and the pages she's already memorized. She no longer receives messages. Her meals are delivered wordlessly. The servants are kind but brisk. No one meets her eyes. This isn't a dungeon, you remind yourself. It's just exile in embroidery. One of the most haunting examples is Queen Caroline of Brunswick. Her marriage to George IV of England was a mess before it even began. He disliked her almost instantly. She was awkward, loud, unrefined by his standards. When he became king, he tried to bar her from her own coronation. Imagine that. The church bells ring, the crowds cheer, and you're locked outside the door. Your crown denied not by fate, but by a man who once promised to love you. She fought, of course, but fighting only made it worse. Public opinion briefly turned in her favor. But the court closed ranks. She was accused of impropriety, subjected to public trials, mocked in songs. And though never convicted of any crime, she died alone, barely remembered. Historians still argue whether Caroline was a misunderstood outsider or a woman who simply wouldn't play the part. Either way, she became one of many royal women who were sidelined not for misdeeds, but for misfitting. There's something eerily consistent about how this plays out. You'll find similar stories in Austria, in Spain, in the glittering halls of Russian palaces. Queens who were praised on their wedding days, then politely discarded when they grew inconvenient. Sometimes they were sent to convents, not as punishment, of course, but as retreat. Think of it as history's softest cage. She needs peace, they'd say. Or, she's chosen a life of prayer. But she didn't choose. She obeyed. One fringe tidbit? Queen Christina of Sweden stepped down voluntarily. Kind of. She disguised herself as a man, fled the country, and converted to Catholicism in secret. Why? Historians debate the reasons: boredom, identity, forbidden desires. Maybe all three. But what's certain is this: she was born to rule and found the throne unbearable. You press your ear to the door. The queen inside sighs. Maybe she's writing letters that will never be sent. Maybe she's remembering a time when the king used to smile at her, even if only for appearances. There's a particular cruelty in being locked away without chains. These queens weren't dragged from courtrooms. They were escorted gently, bowed to, and disappeared. No scandal, no noise, just absence. And absence in court is as loud as a scream. You wonder, what happens to someone when the world stops looking at them? When no one asks for their opinion? When their titles remain, but their presence no longer matters? In many cases, they began to wither, but some adapted. They read more. They prayed harder. They plotted quietly. Take Empress Josephine, Napoleon's first wife. He divorced her when she failed to give him a son, though he claimed to still love her. Afterward, she retreated into her estate at Montmaison. Not bitter, but brilliant. She filled the house with flowers, artists, exotic birds. Diplomats still came to her for advice, and Napoleon continued to write her letters until his death. Even discarded, she found a way to stay relevant. But not every woman had Josephine's charm, or means. For most, the story ended in those cold wings of the palace. A slow, soft descent into silence. You might think the king would forget them completely. And yet, sometimes, he didn't. He would send word, a fruit basket, a poem, a vague apology disguised as a formality. Not love, not regret, just a flicker of recognition. As if to say, I remember you were once something to me. You can almost feel her shrug as she reads such a letter. It's not hatred. It's not grief. It's the quiet realization that her story was never hers to write. She was chosen, used, dismissed, and the world kept turning. Now you rise from your spot by the door and wander the hall again. Each step echoes against the stone. These corridors have seen too many forgotten queens, each wrapped in velvet and silence. Their names are buried beneath the chapters written by men. But if you listen closely, they're still speaking. Through the creak of floorboards, the rustle of curtains, the whisper of paper turning late at night. Their stories weren't erased, just hidden. Tonight, your path winds inward, deeper into the palace, behind a nondescript door, hidden beneath a carved arch of grapes and acanthus leaves. No guards here, no velvet rope, just a low-burning lantern and the hush of something secret. You've entered the training chambers. And what's being taught here isn't swordsmanship or strategy. It's softness. It's silence. It's how to please a king and be forgotten. These are the hidden halls where young girls, usually from noble but impoverished families, are groomed for roles they will never list on any scroll. Not princess, not lady. Something far more delicate and far more dangerous, the royal companion. You watch from a dark corner, barely breathing. A matron with silver hair and a voice like lace is instructing a group of girls no older than 15. They sit straight-backed, eyes wide, hands folded. Each one has been chosen, not for their minds, but for their manners, their skin, their smiles, their ability to disappear behind a king without ever casting a shadow. There's a bowl of rose water in the corner, a rack of silks, a mirror so polished it looks like water. The matron doesn't shout. She whispers. These are lessons in restraint, in suggestion, in the art of being desirable but never demanding. You wonder quietly, how many of them truly understand what they've been chosen for? This wasn't always a formal process, but in many courts, it was structured. The Ottoman Empire had entire schools within the harem, training women in music, literature, and how to soothe the Sultan's fury. Not just lovers, companions, counselors, human perfume bottles, always fragrant, always nearby. The Habsburgs had similar customs. A lady of grace could be summoned to share wine or warm a bed, and her family might receive a favor or land grant in return. Nothing was ever written down, but everyone understood the bargain. Historians still argue whether these practices were protective, giving girls skills to survive, or exploitative to the core. And maybe you think it was both. A gilded cage still traps. Tonight, one girl in the chamber is trembling. Her hands shake slightly as she practices pouring tea, not from clumsiness, but from knowing what comes next. The others steal glances, silent encouragements. You can feel their collective breath, held in unison. They are not allowed to cry, not here. The matron will say, "Tears waste beauty." A fringe tidbit for your quiet mind. In 18th century Korea, selected women trained as gisangs were taught poetry, dance, and conversational arts. Though technically entertainers, they often became confidants to royalty. One was rumored to have prevented an assassination simply by distracting the king long enough for guards to intervene. She was never thanked. You watch as the matron adjusts a girl's posture, nudges her chin up, and says, "Never more than a whisper, never more than half a smile. The king must always feel like he discovered you." You recoil slightly at the precision, but then you notice something else. A flicker of rebellion in one girl's eye. Not hatred, not defiance, just thought. She's watching the matron, but she's also watching you, as if she sees past the room, past the future she's being handed. And you wonder how many of these women, once trained, once used, an edge to rewrite their fate, to trade soft footsteps for louder exits. Some did. A girl trained in the French court's education of favor was quietly passed from one nobleman to another, until she poisoned the third and vanished. Her name never made it to the records, but whispers of La Sorcière Douce, the soft witch, echo in 18th century taverns even now. But most did not vanish. Most remained right where they were placed, inside chambers, inside memories, inside songs no one sings aloud. Their reward was survival. Maybe a child, maybe a modest house, maybe silence. You move past the chamber now, into the small dormitory beside it. It smells of lavender and parchment. On each bed, a folded ribbon, a different color for each rank in the courtly chain. One girl sleeps clutching hers like a lifeline. Another lies awake, eyes fixed on the ceiling, rehearsing what she will say if the king speaks to her or touches her. This world didn't permit their names to last, but their impact echoes through the decisions they altered, the kings they calmed, the alliances they softened just by being near. They were the oil in the gears of diplomacy, not honored, but essential. And yet no one tells bedtime stories about them. No statues, no portraits, just faint mentions in court logs. Attended by a lady of grace, accompanied by a chamber girl. A young companion provided comfort. But tonight, you remember them. Not the queens who were painted, not the kings who were praised. The girls behind the doors, The ones who learned to pour tea and pleasure with equal grace. The ones who were trained not to rule, but to disappear beautifully. And as you pull the velvet curtain closed behind you, you hear it, a faint melody, half hummed from a girl who will never be known, but is singing anyway. Because sometimes, even when history forgets you, your song still lingers in the air. You wake tonight in the echo of footsteps, slow, measured, and heavier than before. A pair of leather slippers glides past the mosaic floor, trailing the scent of sandalwood and sleep. The hour is late, the moon is high, and the king is not headed for the queen's chamber. You follow him in silence, your breath soft against the tapestried walls, past the chapel, past the queen's wing, where the candles are already snuffed and the guards are half asleep, past the wide doors carved with lions and lilies. He doesn't pause. He doesn't knock. He slips into a smaller room with no crest above it, no title, just the faint giggle of a woman who shouldn't be there, but is. It's always puzzled you, hasn't it? Why a king, a man with a queen at his command, would seek out the touch of a servant? Why bypass the throne for the hearth? Why sneak down the corridor instead of summoning his wife? The answer, perhaps, is more human than regal. Queens came with conditions, protocol, prayers, pressure. But servants? They came with warmth, with no demands, with simplicity. You crouch outside that door now, pressing your ear gently against the frame. Inside, you hear soft voices. No declarations of love. No Shakespearean romance. Just comfort. Familiarity. The way someone sighs when they finally don't have to perform. In the French court of Louis the XIII, there were entire months when the queen and king barely spoke. Her duties were ceremonial. His affections lay elsewhere. Sometimes with maids, sometimes with men, sometimes with silence itself. Historians still argue whether it was personal incompatibility or political strategy. But the effect was the same. The queen went cold. She wasn't alone. In the Russian Empire, Tsar Alexander III was married to a devout and reserved Empress Elizabeth. He grew bored of her serenity and found solace in mistresses who laughed too loudly and never quoted scripture. It wasn't always lust. Often, it was laughter. There's a fringe story, a delicious one, of a Polish king who fell in love with his laundress. Not because she was beautiful, though she might have been, but because she smelled like lavender soap and bread. He said she reminded him of the village he came from, the one he'd been ripped from the moment he wore the crown. He gave her a cottage and visited in secret, disguised as a gardener. Queens could never be so ordinary. They had to glitter. They had to inspire. No one wanted a queen who smelled of soap. You drift now into a time before corsets and carriages. Medieval England, perhaps, or the Holy Roman Empire. Even then, the queen's role was to bear sons, host feasts, and perform piety. No one asked if she was loved. No one cared. Meanwhile, in the servants' quarters, the king might be listening to a young scullery maid sing as she scrubs the copper pots, entranced by her voice more than her face. It's not always about rebellion. Sometimes it's about freedom. The king, though powerful, was also a prisoner of expectation. He had to be strong, wise, virile, divine. But with a servant, he could be tired, could confess fear, could ask, "Do you think I'm doing the right thing?" without being judged by a court of robes and rings. And for the servant, it wasn't always love. Sometimes it was survival. Sometimes it was ambition. But often, it was simply being seen. A rare, sparkling moment where a king, a man above all men, chose you. But don't be fooled. Queens weren't blind. Many knew. They saw the glances, heard the footsteps, noticed the way the king came to bed later or not at all. But what could they do? Confrontation could mean disgrace. Silence meant endurance. In some courts, queens grew to tolerate it. In others, they retaliated, coldly, cleverly, or sometimes even with their own affairs. But many simply endured, like living statues of virtue carved from duty. You tiptoe through the palace now, tracing footsteps that don't appear in any painting. These aren't the steps of kings in procession or queens at coronation. These are quiet, messy, human steps, lusty, lonely, longing. And the record keepers? They didn't write these down. Too indecorous, too fleeting, too honest. Yet here's the curious thing. These private choices shaped public policy. A servant could calm a furious king. A whispered opinion could delay a war. A soft joke could undo days of ministerial debate. What began in a borrowed bedroom might end on a battlefield or in a peace treaty. There's a funny little note in a Venetian ambassador's diary from 1582 where he writes, "The king's mistress dislikes the Spanish envoy's boots. I do not like the chances for trade." He wasn't joking. You lean now against a windowsill and look out across the palace gardens, wondering how many alliances rose or fell because a servant made the king laugh harder than the queen ever could. Because here's the truth. Queens were chosen, servants were wanted, and that difference? It rewrote the rules of royalty more than any law ever passed. Tonight, the palace feels different. Quieter, yes, but not with sleep. It's the hush of secrets, of presence unspoken. You're walking not beside the grand halls or perfumed gardens, but down a side corridor, barely wide enough for two. The walls are bare. No portraits, no gold. But the air? It's thick with knowing. This is where real power walks softly in slippers and doesn't need a title to rule. You're following a girl now. No one of consequence, or so it would seem. She carries a basket of fruit for the king's table. She curtsies a little too deeply, her eyes lowered just enough to seem meek. But behind those eyes, a world moves. She's not a favorite, not even a mistress. She's something far more dangerous, beneath notice. You watch her like a shadow, slipping into rooms, overhearing arguments, folding linens near open windows where ministers shout about taxes and border raids. No one sees her, and yet she hears everything. That's how influence works when you're lowborn in a palace of silks. You don't reach for the crown. You learn where it rests when no one's looking. You remember that old tale of the footman who memorized which diplomats drank too much and which ones kissed the wrong hands. He never said a word, not aloud, just passed notes to the royal valet, who passed them to the king, who suddenly knew exactly how to negotiate a treaty. That footman eventually granted a minor title, but his true reward was always being 10 steps ahead. Historians still argue whether these quiet influencers shaped policy by accident or design, but too many strange coincidences pile up for it to be luck alone. A missing document, a servant moved to another post right before a scandal broke, a king suddenly favoring a minister he'd barely spoken to until his chambermaid mentioned his name at breakfast. In the French court, the chambermaids were known to swap rumors between shifts. They called it serviette diplomacy. Laughable? Perhaps. Until you realize that their whisperings determined who sat where at state banquets, and in court, who sits, wears everything. Here's a delicious fringe fact for you. In the Mughal court of India, eunuchs, considered outside the gender roles of the time, were often the most trusted messengers. privy to royal secrets, emotional confessions, and classified documents. One such eunuch, Khwaja Sara Itimad Khan, quietly brokered peace between rival factions with no signature, no title, just access. Access is everything, not just to the bedchamber, but to the silences between words, the sighs after meetings, the discarded letters, the unfinished thoughts. Queens held status, but servants held timing. You press your back against the wall now, unseen, and watch as a maid retrieves a handkerchief from beneath the king's desk. It looks accidental, but you saw her tuck it there earlier, right before he sat down with his advisors. Inside, a lavender scent. Not his wife's. A reminder. A cue? A manipulation? Maybe. Or maybe just a nudge. There's a strange alchemy in how these invisible figures shape visible decisions. You never see their names in marble, but their fingerprints are on everything. The way a monarch turns a phrase, the sudden change in a trade deal, the oddly specific disdain for a duke's new wife. In England, there was a low-ranking kitchen maid, Agnes, they say, who warned the king about a plot to poison his soup. Not because she was loyal, but because she liked the way he smiled at her when he passed through the kitchens. She saved his life, and then vanished. No reward, no parade, just gone. Power, when you're beneath notice, becomes sharper, more flexible. It can't be seen, so it can't be blocked. You slip between conversations, pick up on moods, and learn to lean into them. You serve the wine a second slower when someone needs time to think. You hum a certain song that reminds the king of summer nights. You clean the floor near the map room just when the generals are arguing. A crown can command armies, but a servant can bend the air in a room. And it's not just women. Male servants, too, learn the rhythm of the court. The valet who helped the king dress each morning could sense how tightly to lace the boots, depending on how tense the day ahead seemed. He might accidentally leave behind a note he wasn't supposed to read, or draw attention to a particular book left on the royal chair. Every action was theater. Every silence, an offering. You wonder now, as you walk these echoing halls, how many queens were truly alone in their roles, surrounded by courtiers, yet untouched by true knowledge, while a servant, invisible, orchestrated the dance. The truth is, invisibility was the disguise, the best one. You pause at a narrow staircase. Down there, in the cellars, laundry girls laugh while folding sheets that once swaddled royalty. They know more about the royal tempers than the ministers upstairs. They know who cried last night, who argued, who refused dessert. And though they can't read, they understand the pulse of power better than any scholar. One joke passed between them. If you want to know the future of the kingdom, ask the girl who empties the king's chamber pot. Because she was there, always there, not remembered, but always watching. You find yourself tonight at the edge of a feather mattress, not lying on it, but watching. A low fire casts flickering shadows on tapestries, and outside the window, the wind sighs like an old song. Inside, there are only whispers, and yet these whispers don't lull a king to sleep. They steer nations. This is Pillow Talk. You settle into a corner of the room where no one will notice. There's a servant girl in the bed now, bare feet tucked beneath the velvet coverlet, her head resting on the king's shoulder. His voice is low, not commanding, wondering, questioning, vulnerable. Queens got sermons, ministers got memos, but the girl with her cheek against his collarbone, she got secrets. And that's where real power lived. It's not the words themselves that matter. It's the moment. That weightless space after midnight when masks are off and crowns are set on nightstands. It's when the king is no longer a symbol, just a man. A man with fears, doubts, insecurities he'd never utter in court, but pours like wine into the ear of someone beneath his station, and above all suspicion. In France, King Henry IV was said to confess military worries not to his generals, but to his mistress, Gabrielle d'Estrées. She had no training in warfare, but her quiet confidence reassured him. He made better decisions the next day, people noticed. Historians still argue whether she advised him directly or simply steadied his mind. Same with Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria. He once whispered to a lady-in-waiting that he feared his ministers had grown too powerful. The next month, he removed 2 of them. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe her silence confirmed what his pride wouldn't let him say aloud. You peer over the edge of the mattress now, watching the girl nod along as the king recounts something troubling. An ambassador who insulted him. A letter with too many suggestions. She says little. She doesn't have to. He hears his thoughts through her listening, because sometimes being the one who listens is more powerful than being the one who speaks. The queen might host grand audiences, dressed in rubies, seated on a throne. But she wasn't here. She didn't hear him say, "I don't trust them." She didn't stroke his hair when he said, "I'm tired of pretending I'm always right." In this room, trust isn't built through titles. It's built through breath and softness. A fringe fact: in Japan's Heian period, courtiers often composed love poems not just for romance, but to sway political decisions. It wasn't unusual for a lady in the emperor's court, often a consort, to influence imperial policy by writing a particularly beautiful verse at the right time. No royal edict, just a sigh, a scroll, and a shift in strategy. You lean back now against the bedpost as the king pulls the blanket tighter and closes his eyes. She stays awake. Of course she does. That's the unspoken rule. He sleeps. She stores. And in the morning, maybe she passes a note to his valet, or casually suggests he try the mint tea, not the jasmine, the kind the ambassador prefers. No one will suspect, but the ambassador will feel welcomed, and a negotiation might soften. This is politics by perfume, and it works, but it's not always so soft. Sometimes the person beside the king does push, gently, smartly, calculated compliments that sow distrust. That minister always interrupts you. The duke didn't rise when you entered. Why does the queen always wear mourning colors? She should be celebrating you. Little things, but little things grow. In England, Barbara Palmer, mistress to Charles II, was known to casually mention names she disliked, and watched as those courtiers were reassigned or suddenly fell from favor. She rarely gave direct advice, but her presence was the advice, and the king responded. Historians still argue whether Charles saw through her, whether he allowed her to manipulate him, or simply didn't care. But either way, she got what she wanted. Again and again, even in ancient Rome, emperors were said to share their fears with slaves or freed women, those who could be trusted not to repeat them. The higher you climb, the lonelier it gets. And when you're lonely, you don't need a strategist. You need someone who says, "I see you." Back in the room, the king stirs in his sleep. The girl leans over, brushes his hair from his forehead. A small gesture. No court artist will paint it. No historian will record it. But tomorrow, when the king addresses the council with surprising softness or sudden steel, remember this moment. It didn't come from the war table. It came from the bed. You walk quietly from the room now, shoes silent against the carpet, and feel the weight of everything unspoken. the truths traded in whispers, the futures shaped by warmth. The Queen will never know, the ministers will never ask. But you saw the real council chamber tonight. It had no ceiling, no guards, just a fire, a sigh, and the most powerful sentence in any kingdom. What do you think I should do? It's later now. The moon has dipped behind a cloud, and somewhere a tower clock sighs its way into the next hour. The palace is still, or so it seems. But beneath the hush, something sharp stirs. Not laughter, not whispers, something colder. Tonight, you're walking in the footsteps of the queens who refuse to stay sidelined. Not every queen folded her hands in prayer and faded into velvet shadows. Some watched, learned, waited, and when the moment came, they moved. You pause outside a chamber where candlelight glows under the door. Inside, there's no romance, just revenge. The queen is seated before a mirror. Her maid braids her hair with unusual precision. On the table, not perfume or jewels, but a small glass vial stoppered tightly. Clear liquid, pale as tears. Poison? Maybe. Maybe just a rumor. But you can't help noticing how carefully it's tucked into her sleeve. In a world that crowned men and clothed women in silence, queens who refused to be forgotten had to become dangerous. Not loud, that was easy to crush, but clever, patient, subtle. Take Isabella of France, known later as the she-wolf of France. Her husband, Edward II, was obsessed with a low-born favorite, Hugh Despenser, and neglected Isabella, insulted her publicly, and even stripped her of land. So what did she do? She fled to France, gathered an army, returned with her lover, and forced Edward to abdicate. She didn't just get revenge, she took the throne for her son and ruled from behind it. Historians still argue whether she was cruel or courageous, but what's certain is this: she didn't wait to be pitied, and she wasn't alone. Catherine de' Medici, the Queen Mother of France, was often sidelined early in her marriage. Her husband, Henry II, adored his mistress, Diane de Poitiers. But when he died, Catherine rose like smoke. Quiet, hard to contain. She orchestrated marriages, wars, and political massacres. They called her Machiavellian, poisonous, witch-like. But perhaps they were just terrified of a woman who learned how to survive in a man's game and played it better than they did. You slip through the tapestry now and walk beside one such queen. No army behind her, just a letter in her hand and a plan in her eyes. Her husband has stopped visiting her chambers. She knows why. Everyone does. The servant girl he favors has been seen wearing her old brooch. But the queen won't cry. She's writing to a cousin in Bavaria, a nobleman with debts and soldiers. The letter doesn't say, "Help me." It says, "There is an opportunity." Even without an army, a queen could ruin reputations, banish rivals, whisper into her confessor's ear, and have gossip spread through cathedrals and councils like wildfire. A fringe story from the Ming Dynasty tells of an empress who discovered her husband had taken a new concubine, one who mocked her behind closed doors. She said nothing. She simply gifted the girl a new hairpin, lacquered wood, hollow inside. That night, the concubine fell ill. By morning, she was gone. The empress wept publicly. She was praised for her compassion. No one ever found the hairpin. You turn a corner now and see a young queen at chapel, head bowed, pious, devout, and yet, behind her stillness, you notice her eyes shift, counting who kneels where, who crosses themselves too quickly. She's not here for prayer. She's here for reconnaissance. Because sometimes revenge didn't come in poison. It came in policy. Queen Mary of Scots was betrayed by love and politics alike. Imprisoned by her cousin Elizabeth, she spent years locked away, but still managed to coordinate plots from her cell, wrapped in embroidery, smuggled through ink and thread. She signed letters with invisible ink. Her last attempt failed, and it cost her her life. But she died a queen who tried, who fought. And that's what you begin to see in these women. They weren't all saints. Some were ruthless, cold, even cruel. But they were alive behind the portraits. They didn't always accept silence. They carved power from stone. Back in the chamber, the queen lifts the glass vial once more. Her hand trembles, not from fear, from rage. She doesn't want to kill. Not really. What she wants is control. She wants to be the one who chooses when the story changes. Who's written in? Who's erased? Because for centuries, queens were written about. Some, finally, learned to write themselves in. And if a servant girl's necklace breaks mysteriously, or a minister trips down the wrong staircase, or the king's wine starts to taste different, well, the queen never left her room. She was praying. She was sewing. She was waiting, just as everyone wanted. Only now she is not waiting for him. She's waiting for you to notice. The moon's dipped lower now, and the palace is quieter than ever. A lull inside a lull. You trace your fingers along a chilled wall where candlelight fades before it can find the corners. But tonight, you follow not queens or servants, not kings or whispers. Tonight, you follow footsteps padded in wool and prayer into the cloistered silence of a convent. This is where some queens went when they were done being queens. You pass through iron gates that don't clang. They sigh. The air smells of dried herbs, ink, and beeswax. The world here is narrow, but it doesn't feel small. It feels folded. Like a secret note passed between centuries. This is the soft exile of the clever. Not a fall from grace, but a retreat by design. Because not every queen went mad or faded quietly. Some stepped off the throne and into the chapel, where rules were different. And sometimes bendable. You walk now beside a young queen who has just removed her crown. Her hands are still stiff from years of holding a scepter. She doesn't cry. She just watches as her reflection vanishes in a polished brass bowl. Here, her name won't be called, but her story isn't over. Not by a long shot. Take Christina of Denmark. Married off at the age of 16, widowed within a year. She was offered another marriage by Henry VIII. She famously refused, saying she'd only marry him if she had two heads, one for herself and one for the axe. Instead, she chose a different path. Political. Calculated. Not humble. Not silent. Historians still argue whether queens who retreated to convents did so willingly or under pressure. But some made it a tactical move. In the walls of the cloister, you were outside court politics, but not blind to them. You pass under an arch and see a group of women bent over manuscripts, copying prayers with exacting care. But that isn't all they're copying. One holds a letter, the kind not meant to exist, smuggled in a loaf of bread, hidden in embroidery thread. The letter mentions a duke, a ship, a secret meeting. Not exactly amen, is it? There's a fringe tale of a queen who faked her religious devotion so convincingly she became abbess of her convent and used it as a front to funnel money, arrange noble marriages, and negotiate land deals. Her church never caught on, or maybe they did, and simply admired the finesse. You sit beside a quiet window where another queen once prayed. She wasn't pious when she arrived, just bruised. Her husband had taken a new mistress, one young enough to be her daughter. The court mocked her, so she left. For God, she said. But what she found here was not God, at least not right away. It was strategy, solitude as armor. She wrote letters in Latin, studied legal texts, learned how to influence bishops who still wrote to her, seeking advice. Her name never returned to court, but her fingerprints did. On decisions, on delays, on subtle denials that turned wars cold before they could burn. Convents weren't just places of silence. They were information hubs, safe zones, spaces where a queen could still be addressed with respect while moving unseen. You move past the kitchens, where the scent of lentils and garlic lingers. A novice stirs a pot while whispering to a visitor cloaked in anonymity. Nothing urgent, just a name, a time, a warning, and you realize, in this world, the veil isn't just cloth, it's cover. There's one queen, we'll never know her name, who supposedly staged her own death, slipped into a convent in disguise, and lived the rest of her life as a scribe. She wrote prayers for children she'd never meet, but in the margins, she scratched little notes, jokes, memories, lines of poetry. Some believe she was the lost wife of a German king. Others think she was never royal at all, just a woman who knew too much and needed to vanish. Either way, her handwriting survives. The queen you follow tonight walks barefoot through a garden of thyme and rosemary. Her hair is still long. The abbess hasn't made her cut it yet. She touches each leaf like she's remembering something from before, or planting something for later. Queens weren't always dethroned by force. Sometimes they surrendered the game so they could win it another way. Convents offered control in a world where women were expected to serve or sparkle. Here, you could be clever without drawing daggers. You could advise under the veil of divine wisdom. After all, who questions a woman who kneels before dawn? And here's the quiet truth. Some queens were safer in convents than they ever were in court. No poisoned goblets, no venomous smiles from rival mistresses, just the sound of bells and the slow reclaiming of breath. You hear that bell now. A low, solemn toll that doesn't startle. It grounds. The queen crosses herself, but her eyes aren't on the crucifix. They're on the hills beyond the cloister walls, because even here, even in wool and wood smoke, she still watches the kingdom, still listens for the name she once answered to, still waits, perhaps, for the day someone remembers who she was and wonders where she went. And maybe, just maybe, she'll decide to answer. Tonight, you don't start in a palace. You begin on a dirt path just outside the castle walls, near the stables where lanterns swing in the breeze and someone hums a melody that doesn't belong in the throne room. You're not among nobles. You're not among priests. You're among the people who smell of hay and soap and fire. And among them, a story is beginning. Because sometimes, a king falls in love with someone who shouldn't even be at court. You walk behind him now, the king, not in his ceremonial robes, but in a simple cloak worn at the hem. He's headed not to council, not to battle, not to prayer. He's headed to see her. A laundress, a flower girl, a baker's daughter. Maybe she delivered wine once. Maybe he heard her sing while scrubbing the flagstones. Maybe she simply looked him in the eye when no one else dared. And that, oddly, was enough. You hide behind the stable door as they meet. No guards, no witnesses, just a flicker of breath in the dark. She curtsies too deeply. He lifts her chin, and in that glance, the entire kingdom teeters. Because when a king loves a commoner, nothing is truly common anymore. There's something dangerous about this kind of love. Not because it's scandalous, but because it's real. The court is built on strategy. Love is inconvenient. It doesn't play by protocol. And so, history has tried again and again to erase these women, but you can still find them. In footnotes, in love letters, in poetry, tucked between trade agreements. Take Agnes Sorel, a name that lingers like perfume. She was the mistress of Charles VII of France, and though she was technically nobility, she was low-ranking. Still, her beauty and intelligence won his heart. He gave her jewels, titles, and rooms in the palace. She advised him on matters of war. His mood lightened around her. His enemies noticed. So did his allies. And when she died suddenly, possibly poisoned, he was devastated. Historians still argue whether she was killed by a rival or simply the victim of mercury-laced makeup. But either way, her influence was undeniable. She changed how kings looked at power and at love. And then there's Jane Shore, mistress to Edward IV of England. She wasn't royal. She wasn't even wealthy. But she was clever, warm, and famously kind. After the king's death, she was dragged through the streets as punishment, forced to walk barefoot, clothed only in a sheet. Humiliation, public penance. But the people didn't jeer. They pitied her. Some even wept, because she had been one of the few who used her influence to help, not harm, to protect, not punish. You slip now into a back room where a servant, no more than 17, is lighting a candle. She hums to herself, unaware that the king is watching from the corridor. He doesn't enter. Not yet. He simply listens and smiles. He's not thinking of treaties or heirs or bloodlines. He's thinking of the way she moves, the light behind her eyes, the fact that she doesn't try to impress him, and how that impresses him more than anything. This kind of love doesn't fit into royal architecture. It bends walls, cracks ceilings. It terrifies everyone, especially the court, where nobles clawed their way into favor, only to be undone by someone who didn't even ask for it. There's a fringe tale from 18th century Portugal of a king who fell for a seamstress. He built her a private garden filled with lavender, and they met there every week for 7 years. When she died, he banned anyone from entering that garden again. The gates still stand, locked, vine-covered, and silent. Love has always been the great interrupter of empire. And yet, the most honest parts of kings were often revealed not on the battlefield, but beside someone soft-spoken and undesired by society. You wonder how many laws were signed late, not because of politics, but because a girl kissed the king's shoulder and made him forget his pen. Not every story ends sweetly. Often, these loves were punished. The woman was married off, banished, or buried under a false name. Sometimes the king was forced to give her up, for appearance, for alliance, for control. But sometimes he didn't. Sometimes a king abandoned court and crowned for a woman with no dowry and no title. Sometimes he wrote poetry in the margins of state documents. Sometimes he held her hand during storms, even if it meant losing half his kingdom. You lean against the wall now, listening to footsteps. 2 sets, moving together down the corridor, quieter than scandal, louder than law. And you realize, in a world obsessed with legacy, it's the unsanctioned love that leaves the deepest mark. Not the arranged marriage, not the diamond-studded coronation, but the girl in the linen dress who made a king remember he had a heart. Tonight, you drift through the hush of drawn curtains and the thick scent of beeswax and pressed parchment. The fire's low, the windows are latched, and a drawer creaks open slowly. Not for treasure, but for something far more intimate. A letter? You peek over a shoulder, not just anyone's. This is the Queen, and her hands tremble only slightly as she reads. The wax seal is broken. The ink still smells faintly of clove and cedar wood. It's from him, not the king, the other him. You sit beside her, as invisible as regret, as she rereads every word in the flickering light. Because in palaces full of pomp and policy, it wasn't the declarations that shaped lives. It was the unsent letters, the ones written in secret, hidden in slippers, stuffed in prayer books, and sometimes burned. Love letters are the most dangerous kind of history. Because they're personal, because they're messy, because they weren't supposed to survive. And yet, some do. You can imagine it, can't you? A maid scribbling a note between her shifts, blushing as she folds it. A footman slipping it under the king's plate. A queen, alone in her chambers, pressing lavender between pages to keep the scent of him just a little longer. Take the letters of Napoleon to Josephine. He begged, teased, confessed. He wrote, "I wake consumed with thoughts of you," then threatened divorce, then begged again. He was a conqueror of nations, yet completely undone by love. His ink wavered when he was denied her. Historians still argue whether he truly loved her or simply hated not being loved back. But either way, the letters remain fragile, wrinkled, desperate. And then there are the letters that never reached their destination. In the late 1500s, a serving woman in the English court of Elizabeth III kept a bundle of parchment beneath the floorboards. It wasn't discovered until 300 years later. Tiny scrolls tied with ribbon, none of them addressed. Just initials. She had fallen for a nobleman far above her rank. The notes were poetic, a little clumsy, and entirely real. One read, "When I serve wine, I watch your hand, not the glass." No reply was ever found. You slip into another chamber now, smaller, tucked behind the Queen's library. A drawer slides open. Inside, more letters. These are folded with precision, each sealed with wax so faint it's nearly dust. The handwriting? Not royal, not refined, but familiar. Because the servant who dares to write the king is either a fool or in love. Here's a curious fringe fact. In the court of Philip the Fisher of Spain, a stable boy named Diego reportedly wrote nightly letters to the Queen's maid, who was rumored to be carrying on with the king himself. In one note, he wrote, "He takes you in daylight. I only get shadows." It reads more like poetry than complaint. He was dismissed quietly. The letters remained hidden in the lining of a velvet saddle. Letters weren't always romantic. Some were confessions, others warnings. Some queens wrote to distant cousins in code, sharing intelligence wrapped in lullabies or inventory lists. 2 bolts of linen, a dozen lemons, and 5 barrels of salt might mean the Duke is planning a coup. Watch the port. A single word in the wrong hands could lead to ruin. And that was the thrill. Writing in the dark, sealing with wax, knowing that love might arrive or destroy you. One queen. Historians still debate whether it was Anne of Austria. Supposedly wrote love notes not to a lover, but to her own sister, describing the loneliness of being married into power. "My crown weighs less than silence," she wrote, "but more than love." You sit now in the Queen's chair, listening to the rustle of paper. One drawer contains dozens of letters in a man's hand, not the king's. She reads one aloud in a whisper only the curtains can hear. And when the final line comes, "If I had been born a prince, I would have burned the world to reach you." She folds the parchment again, slowly, like a ritual. She places it back, presses her palm against it for a moment, and locks the drawer. Tomorrow she will walk in state beside her husband. Smile. Bless. receive. But tonight she remembered who once made her feel alive. Not every letter was answered. Some were intercepted. Some burned before lips could finish the name at the bottom. But the ink remains in the grain of the wood. The smell of it lingers in the folds of gowns never worn again. The words echo, even when the rooms are empty. You slip away now, brushing past shelves that hold no names, just stories wrapped in string, and you think, in a world obsessed with monuments, it's the smallest things. The locked drawers, the folded parchment, the dried violets that hold the truest weight. Because love, especially forbidden love, doesn't want to be witnessed. It just wants to be remembered. The palace is warm tonight, but not from the hearth, from breath, from closeness, from tension thick enough to tangle in your hair as you pass through the narrow corridor leading to the royal apartments just beyond the Queen's wing. You pause, not because you're afraid, but because you feel it, something sacred, something scandalous. She's not a servant this time, not a secret. She is the king's official mistress. And yes, that was a real job. No coy glances across gardens, no hasty visits under moonlight. This woman has rooms, maids, jewels gifted in daylight. She enters the royal theater not from the side, but from the center. She's announced at banquets. Her portrait hangs in the hall. She isn't hiding. She's reigning, in her own way. You trail her now as she walks, slow and measured, through the golden gallery. Not quite royal, not quite private. She nods to dukes, accepts the smallest bow from a cardinal. The Queen? She's sitting at the opposite end of the room, smile frozen. Hands folded, fury hidden beneath layers of silk. This is not a love triangle. It's a power play. Because for much of history, kings didn't just have mistresses. They maintained them, publicly. Their very presence sent signals, political, social, even military. Take Madame de Pompadour. The name alone tastes like sugar and steel. She was the official mistress, maîtresse en titre, of Louis XIV, a position with a title, a salary, and enough access to influence wars. She introduced Enlightenment thinkers to the king, softened his moods, guided his policy. The Queen? Quiet. Respected, but never intimate. Historians still argue whether Pompadour truly ruled the king's heart or merely filled a void. But the facts remain. Ministers feared her. Artists courted her. Enemies envied her. And she never needed a crown. You pass now through her chambers, not dusty or secret, but luminous. There's a harp, a caged canary, perfume bottles arranged like an army of glass, and a calendar with initials written in red. Not of saints, but of statesmen. Because she has meetings, quiet ones, behind fans, between dances. This is politics wrapped in petals. There's a fringe account from Sweden. King Gustav III had a known mistress who acted as an unofficial ambassador. At one masquerade ball, she whispered to the king that Russia's envoy was bluffing. 2 weeks later, Sweden delayed a treaty. That delay changed everything. You slip into her drawing room now, where letters lie open. One from a general, one from a duchess, one unsigned, but pressed with the seal of a rival court. She reads each with practiced detachment, the way queens read scriptures. But this is scripture of survival. You wonder, how did she get here? She wasn't born to it. No woman was born to be an official mistress. You earn it. Not by being beautiful, though that helps, but by being useful, entertaining, clever enough to flatter without fawning, comfortable enough to make a king forget he rules a kingdom. The queen may rule the schedule, but the mistress rules the mood. And mood? That decides whether a minister is received, whether a pardon is granted, whether war waits another day. It's easy to hate her, isn't it? To see her as an intruder, a distraction. But pause. She walks a tightrope above daggers. 1 misstep, and she's a temptress. 2, and she's a liability. A threat. Queens may be bound by duty. Mistresses? By danger. Because once the king tires of her, she vanishes. Not always cruelly, but always completely. Some fared well. Louise de la Vallière was mistress to Louis XIII. When she lost his affection, she joined a convent. She said it was for God. Perhaps it was for peace. Others weren't so lucky. Thérèse du Parc, mistress to Louis XIII's son, died mysteriously after a political scandal. Her death wasn't recorded in court logs, just noted as unfortunate. You watch as the mistress, regal in all but title, accepts a glass of wine from a servant. She smiles. She laughs, but her fingers tremble, just slightly, as she lifts the cup. She knows. They always know, because everyone loves the mistress, until they don't. Still, while she holds the king's favor, she is untouchable. There's a story whispered through the walls of Versailles. A duchess once tried to slight Madame de Berry, the last official mistress of Louis XV. The duchess was promptly reassigned to a rural estate, known for its swamps and smell. Her offense? Refusing to greet the mistress. Just one curtsy. Unsaid. It wasn't about lust. It was about proximity. Power lived near the crown. And she, however scandalous, stood closest. And the queen. She watched, dined with her, sometimes even complimented her gown, all while fire burned behind her eyes, because refusal would seem weak, or worse, jealous. And a queen could not be jealous of someone who didn't wear a crown. So, she smiled. That's the game. The mistress smiles to stay close. The queen smiles to stay tall. Both wear gowns stitched with thorns. And the king? He laughs, unaware, or pretending to be, that the room could erupt in poison or poetry at any moment. You slip out of her chamber now, past doors that open too easily and close too softly. The hall is dark, but the influence remains, in the scent on the drapes, in the laugh that still echoes, in the way a king paused once, just long enough to listen to someone who wasn't supposed to matter, and made her matter more than anyone else. The palace tonight feels like it's holding its breath. You move through mirrored halls where every reflection is a mask, and every smile is sharpened glass. Somewhere deep inside, a string quartet plays a soft, stately march. But you're headed to a different kind of performance. One where the audience is only 2 people, and neither of them is clapping. You've arrived at the Queen's Salon, not a place of rest, but a place of restraint, because tonight she is hosting the King's mistress. Yes, hosting. The Queen stands beneath a canopy of painted clouds, draped in pearls and patience. Across from her, lounging slightly too casually on a chaise, is the mistress, radiant, poised, and entirely unwelcome. You step lightly along the wall, invisible but watching, because this is the moment everyone in court holds their breath for, the frozen smile of a queen forced to entertain the woman who warms her husband's bed, not in secret, not in scandal, in daylight, in full view. It's not uncommon. In fact, it was expected. You see, in many European courts, particularly France, England, and Italy, kings made no effort to hide their paramours. They were paraded at parties, seated beside royalty at feasts, and introduced with all the formality of noble blood. The queens were expected to be gracious, and so they were. Outwardly, but inwardly, they were coiled steel. Take Queen Maria Teresa of Spain, wife of Louis X. His mistress, Madame de Montespan, lived in nearby apartments and attended state functions with him. Maria Teresa remained composed, said little, smiled faintly. But when she died, Louis was not at her side. He was with Montespan. And when court officials opened her prayer book, they found a note: God sees all, even what the king ignores. Historians still argue whether queens truly accepted their husbands' lovers, or whether they simply endured them. But what's clear? The resentment was real, and sometimes it cracked the marble beneath their slippers. You hear the queen's voice now, soft, sweet, but edged like satin over glass. She compliments the mistress's new brooch. A gift from the king, perhaps, one that once might have been hers. The mistress replies, demure, perhaps even sincere. But sincerity doesn't matter here. This isn't a conversation. It's a duel, without swords, without blood, only gestures, phrases dipped in politeness and poison. In the court of Charles II of England, Queen Catherine of Braganza was famously forced to dine with her husband's many mistresses. One, Barbara Palmer, flaunted her powers so openly that courtiers joked Catherine should ask her permission to speak. The queen responded not with fury, but with frost. Her silence became a wall no one could climb. That was her rebellion. Not rage, but distance. And here's your fringe fact. In 18th century Russia, Empress Catherine the Great, though rarely a wife in the traditional sense, had official lovers who were paraded before the court, like trophies. One of her successors, however, once had to play host to a czar's mistress who'd arrived with her own entourage, and demanded her tea be brewed separately with spring water. The empress smiled, then saw to it the mistress's estate was seized within the week. A quiet message. I see you, and I do not need to raise my voice. You shift now toward the far end of the salon where footmen pour wine. You catch the glance between two court ladies, a flicker of amusement, or perhaps pity. Everyone knows. Everyone watches, but no one interferes. The queen rises. The mistress curtsies. A perfect curtsy, the kind practiced in candlelight. The kind that says, I respect you, and I don't fear you, in the same motion. And you wonder what goes through a queen's mind in this moment? Maybe she's remembering the night her husband first stopped visiting her room. Maybe she's thinking of her wedding day, when they told her she'd marry not for love, but for duty. Maybe she's rehearsing, silently, the exact phrasing she'll use to the ambassador tomorrow when asked about court harmony. Or maybe she's thinking of her own secret. The letter tucked behind her mirror, the look her chamberlain gave her yesterday, the tiny rebellion only she knows about. Because queens were not always victims. They were strategists, survivors. They knew that being seen beside the mistress made them look benevolent, strong, untouched. But inside, they kept score. One misstep, and the mistress would fall. One whisper to the right noble, one nod to the wrong bishop, and a gift from the king could become a curse. The queen turns to leave now, her gown whispering across the marble. She nods politely to the woman still sitting on the chaise. The mistress lowers her eyes. Maybe out of respect. Maybe because she suddenly wonders what it would feel like to fall from favor. And you? You follow the queen. Because you realize she may not rule her husband's heart, but she rules his world. She doesn't shout. She doesn't weep. She just waits. And in court, the one who waits without blinking usually wins. The court is quiet tonight, but not peacefully so. You feel it the moment you slip past the guard post and into the great hall. tension riding the air like static before a storm. Fans flutter faster. Eyes avoid eyes. Something has happened. Someone looked too long. You follow the trail, past silver platters untouched, goblets half filled, the faint strain of a lute abandoned mid-song. And there, on the far edge of the ballroom, a silence louder than applause. A nobleman's jaw is tight. A foreign prince's eyes are narrowed. And between them, a woman. Smiling, just one glance, just one slow turn during the dance. And now the kingdom holds its breath. Because sometimes, a wink starts a war. You wouldn't believe how many royal conflicts began not with treaties or weapons, but with courtship. Flirtation. A brush of the hand, a letter left open too long, a dance held a second too close. In a world where kings ruled by divine right and queens were symbols of alliance, affection could be political dynamite. Take the War of the Spanish Succession, a complicated mess of inheritances, promises, and egos, but nestled between the policy and the paperwork. A story that whispers of a court lady who caught the eye of the wrong prince. Her favor with one suitor was taken as a slight by another. The insult festered, twisted into accusations of dishonor. And suddenly, nations mobilized. Historians still argue whether her involvement was genuine or fabricated. A scapegoat in silk, but the timing is too sharp to ignore. You trace a similar thread in 14th century Italy, where the rival city-states of Florence and Milan simmered with tension. A Milanese ambassador was seen publicly complimenting the Florentine duke's wife, a compliment laced with too much warmth. The Florentine court exploded, trade stalled, soldiers were dispatched. A flirtation, they said, but the consequences, blood. Here's a fringe tale you won't find in most textbooks. In 1627, a minor noble in the Austrian court was caught exchanging poems with the emperor's sister. Harmless enough, until the emperor learned one of the poems referenced a secret meeting in the palace chapel. The nobleman vanished. No trial, no charges. Just gone. The court said nothing, but within a month, 2 regions under Habsburg control rebelled. Coincidence or consequence? You pause now beside the throne dais where a gold-inlaid fan rests, forgotten. It belongs to the Duchess who winked, the one at the center of tonight's tension. She's gone now, escorted quietly by palace guards, not in punishment, but in protection. Because when power is unstable, even affection becomes dangerous. Imagine being a woman whose glance could redraw borders. Some knew their power. Anne Boleyn famously flirted with the entire French court before returning to England and captivating Henry VIII. Her charm was no accident. She understood that attention was a weapon and wielded it with devastating precision. But attention is a double-edged sword. One smile too long, and you're a temptress. One touch too bold, and you're a threat. Queens had to be careful. Mistresses had to be sharper. Even servants, especially servants, were taught how to avoid the king's gaze unless invited. Because once you were seen, you could no longer be forgotten, and not every kingdom allowed its monarchs to love freely. In some courts, dances were choreographed not just for beauty, but for distance. Which hand to offer, which direction to turn, because love could be fatal. Not always in violence, but in consequence. You walk now into the study of a minister who holds a quill like a sword. He's scribbling notes about an envoy's wife, too warm in her greetings, too familiar. He draws a line through the trade agreement. Untrustworthy, he writes, because sometimes diplomacy fails not at the negotiation table, but over champagne and glances. There's a reason why so many palaces installed long mirrors and hidden galleries, so monarchs could watch, observe who leaned too close, who danced too many times, who left the room at just the right or wrong moment, and behind every mirror, a servant girl or a page taking mental notes. You pass one now, a boy of 15, barely noticed, but he knows who smiled when, who lingered, who touched. It's said that in Versailles, the grandest scandals began at the masquerades. Under masks, truths emerged, lovers found one another, enemies found leverage, and one such party, a single stolen kiss behind the Fountain of Diana, led to a decade-long feud between two duchies. The kiss wasn't the crime. The implication was, because when feelings became known, they became weapons. And so, queens learned to speak with their eyes and say nothing at all. Mistresses mastered the art of omission, answering questions that were never asked. And servants, they learned to forget. You walk back into the ballroom now where the music resumes, a little faster, a little louder, as if to drown out what just happened. But the king has noticed. So has the ambassador. So has everyone. And tomorrow, letters will be written, tones will shift, borders will harden. All because someone looked at someone else like they meant it. And in a court built on masks, that's the most dangerous move of all. The castle is still tonight, but only on the surface. Beneath the chandeliers and embroidered ceilings, something stirs. Not scandal, not whispers. Something rarer, something regal. You're following footsteps now, not of a king or queen, not of a mistress or servant, but of someone who defied the whole arrangement. A servant who became sovereign. Yes, it happened. Rarely. Quietly. Usually after great resistance and scandal, but sometimes against every law of blood and birth, the crown slid not down a lineage, but sideways into the hands of someone who had once fetched water or lit the hearth. You walk beside her now. No title, not yet. Just a girl with sharp eyes and steady hands, moving through palace corridors with her head bowed. She brings the king his wine, brushes past nobles who don't see her. But she listens, she learns, and above all, she waits. Because power, when it's not handed to you, must be stolen with silence. You've heard the story of Roxolana, born Alexandra, a Ukrainian girl taken into the Ottoman Empire as a slave. She was brought to the harem of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. Not the first, not the most beautiful, but she was clever. So clever that he freed her, married her, breaking centuries of precedent, and made her his legal wife. From servant to sultana. Historians still argue how much influence she had. Some say she manipulated politics and steered wars. Others claim she simply offered emotional peace. But either way, she reshaped the court, not by wielding a sword, but by making herself indispensable. That's the trick, isn't it? Not demanding power, but becoming needed. There's a fringe tale from 17th century India of a kitchen maid named Anju, who, through a series of accidents and political disasters, became the de facto advisor to a Maratha prince. She cooked for him after his official chefs were poisoned, stayed by his side through illness, read messages aloud when no one else was trusted. Within a year, she had her own rooms. Within 2, her own seal. Her name was never recorded in state documents, but her initials appeared on dozens of military dispatches. A ghost in gold. Back in the palace, you feel the shift. The girl you follow is no longer fetching wine. She's advising the steward on who sits where. She's correcting a duke's memory. Gently, without offense. the king begins asking for her opinion. Once, then again, then always. Not because she seduced him, not because she tricked him, because she was present, because she listened when no one else did, because she said, maybe don't trust him. And it turned out to be right. And now, she's not the one entering the room. She's the one summoned. Some resisted, of course. The old guard always does. They whispered, she was born to carry linens. She knows nothing of land or law. She didn't come from us. But power once tasted doesn't return itself neatly to the drawer. She stayed. She adapted. She redefined what authority looked like. You slip now into a gallery lined with portraits. Queens, consorts, mistresses, no servants. But you wonder how many of these painted eyes once looked with envy toward a woman not born royal, yet more powerful than any of them. Remember Madame de Maintenon? She began as a governess to the children of Louis XIV's mistress. Through wit and grace, she became the king's secret wife. Never crowned, never announced, but so trusted that ministers consulted her before royal decrees were issued. She wrote once, "It is not birth that makes power. It is proximity and usefulness." And sometimes it was love. But love alone wasn't enough. It had to be coupled with patience, calculation, resilience. Imagine what it took for a servant to survive court politics without lineage to protect her. She had no armies, no dowry, no alliances. All she had was awareness, a perfect memory of who said what, an ability to be invisible when needed, and impossible to ignore when it counted. And some rose all the way. You walk now beside a man, not a king, not yet, a valet. He ties the king's boots, he lights the candles, he hears things, he remembers. And one day when the king is assassinated, he doesn't flee, he stays. He stabilizes the household, marries the king's cousin, takes on his debts, keeps peace. Within 2 years, he's declared regent. And after that, ruler. It's not fiction. It's just forgotten. Because official histories don't like it when the story doesn't follow the bloodline. But the palace remembers. The halls remember. And now, you do too. Because sometimes a servant didn't just steal a crown. They wore it better. The palace is unusually quiet tonight. Not with rest, but with absence. Somewhere deep in the belly of the court, a door has been left open, and through it, a story has slipped away. You follow its ghost now, down the servants' stair, past the painted halls, beyond the reach of oil lamps and official records. Because tonight, the queen is gone, not dead, not exiled, not dismissed, gone, in the most dangerous, most poetic way. She vanished on purpose. You trace her trail through rumor and ribbon. A riding cloak missing from the wardrobe. A pair of slippers found muddy by the orchard gate. A chambermaid swears she saw her light a candle in the chapel at dawn. Another says she never lit it. She just watched it burn. This is not escape as desperation. It is escape as strategy. And though history likes its queens still and silent, every so often, one decides she'd rather live anonymous than die ornamented. Take Queen Christina of Sweden. Again, not just a ruler, but an unruly one. She refused to marry, dressed in men's clothing, and eventually abdicated her throne entirely. She faked her own death, vanished across borders, and re-emerged in Rome as a Catholic convert, dazzling the Pope with her wit and confusing nearly every ambassador alive. Historians still argue, was she mad, enlightened, or simply done with being controlled? She wrote, "I was born free, and I mean to live free." Not every vanishing queen left such poetry behind. Most left. Silence. There's a fringed tale from 15th century Spain. A queen who disappeared one night during a thunderstorm. No body, no ransom, no note. Decades later, a noble woman was found living quietly in a coastal village under a false name, teaching children to read. Some said it was her. Some said it couldn't be. But when her grave was finally uncovered, it bore a ring with the royal crest. Turned inward. You step now into a hidden room behind the queen's bedchamber. Dusty. Unused. And yet, there's a diary on the table. The last page reads only, "They've chosen my silence. I choose my absence." You sit beside it, letting the weight of that choice settle. Because disappearing, when you are a queen, is more than running. It is rejecting the role. Queens were raised to endure, to breed heirs, to bless harvests, to die politely. But some queens, when faced with a life of being watched but never heard, crowned but never kissed, chose the scandal of starting over. They faked illnesses, traded clothes with chambermaids, paid off carriage drivers, and simply left. Sometimes the court invented a death easier than admitting a royal walked out the front door. Sometimes they whispered of madness. She imagined things. She became difficult. She wandered into the woods, but she didn't wander. She ran, and in doing so, rewrote her name into the margins of history. Not gone, just harder to find. You imagine one now, years later, in a cottage by the sea. Wrinkled hands, flour-dusted apron. She feeds the chickens, hums a song once played in a grand ballroom. No one bows, no one commands. She wakes when she likes, sleeps when she chooses. She doesn't miss the crown. Not really. Just the moonlight on the stone terrace, the rustle of gowns, the thrill of choosing not to choose for once. Her name is long gone from state documents. The portraits are raised. But maybe, just maybe, the night breeze still carries her laughter past the castle walls. And what of the king? Some searched, sent riders, issued statements, blamed enemies. Some simply replaced her. One king reportedly toasted his wife's disappearance. "She's freer than I am," he said. She finally found peace. You step back into the palace hallway now, but you don't feel the same. You notice how many doors are locked from the outside, how many smiles are painted on, how many footsteps sound like they're being followed. And you wonder, how many others wanted to vanish? How many queens dreamed not of power but of obscurity? And how many found it? Maybe the better question is, how many still would? Because in a world where being seen means being owned, the most radical act isn't ruling, it's walking away. The fire in the hearth is nearly out tonight. Just a flicker, just enough to cast a faint glow on the edge of the king's robe as he kneels, not before an altar, not before a queen, but alone. He's older now, not in years perhaps, but in weight. You can see it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his crown rests beside him instead of on his head. He is remembering. And tonight, you are remembering with him. Because kings, for all their power, have one terrible weakness: they're human. And humans regret. You settle beside him in the shadows of a private chapel. No candles lit, no gold on display. Just stone walls and breath. And silence, the kind of silence that echoes louder than any fanfare. This is not the king who laughed at feasts or stormed into battle. This is the man who once made choices, bold, selfish, strategic, and now must live with them, and sometimes apologize for them. Kings rarely beg in public, but in the dark, in prayer, or in the quiet agony of memory, Some begged harder than any poet ever dared to write. There's a story about Henry II of England. After his mistress Rosamond Clifford died, some say poisoned, others say simply broken, he reportedly built her a tomb covered in roses and returned to it often. One servant claimed he spoke to her as if she still sat beside him. Historians still argue whether it was love or guilt, but the weight of something pulled at him until his death. You can almost hear him now. Not a king, just a man who failed someone who loved him too much. Further east, Tsar Alexander of Russia is said to have spent his final years racked with guilt over the death of his wife Elizabeth. Their marriage had been cold, distant. He had taken other lovers. But when she died, he vanished from court life. Some believe he faked his own death out of penance and lived as a monk under the name Fyodor Kuzmich. A fringe theory, yes, but the records? They whisper, and sometimes whispers are truer than edicts, because regret needs no throne. It needs a quiet room and a heart too full. You move now through an antechamber where the walls are lined with portraits. Mistresses once adored, now unnamed. Some were dismissed, some were ruined. One or two, maybe, were mourned. But the letters remain. You find one, unsigned, unfinished, a blot of ink where a hand hesitated. It reads, "If I could undo one moment, it would not be a battle. It would be the night I did not come to your door." Was it ever sent? Probably not. Kings often dictated love, but remorse? That was written in solitude. There's another letter. From a queen to her king. "I forgive you, not because I must, but because you never learned how to love without breaking." You wonder who broke more, the one who left, or the one who stayed and realized too late. There's a fringe tale from Poland about a king who, on his deathbed, confessed to sending the wrong woman away. Not the queen, not the mistress, someone else. A maid who had made him laugh when he was grieving. He gave her a ring. She refused it. She wanted nothing from him but kindness. He never gave it. When he died, the ring was found in his hand, not the royal signet. Hers. And here's the thing. Kings always thought they had time. Time to send a letter. Time to soften. Time to fix it. But thrones don't wait. And neither do the women who learned they were only loved in hindsight. You sit now in the chapel beside the king. He rises slowly, eyes closed. He doesn't speak. He doesn't need to. His silence is the apology. And who is he apologizing to? Maybe to the queen he neglected. Maybe to the mistress he used. Maybe to himself. For realizing that crowns can't hold the people who mattered most. Regret isn't loud. It's not even royal. It's small, personal, late. But tonight, it walks the halls like a ghost with perfect posture. It lingers on the pillows of beds left cold. It flickers in the corners of love letters that end mid-sentence. And it bends kings to their knees, not before God, but before the memory of someone who once smiled at them without needing to bow. The palace is nearly asleep now. Not just still, softened, like bread left to rise, like silk pooling on the floor. The fire has burned to its last embers. The guards are slouched, eyes heavy. And the wind doesn't rattle the windows anymore. It only sighs. You move slowly through the final hallway. No rush now. This is the part of the night when everything has already happened. The choices, the touches, the banishments, the tears no one saw. What's left are linens, not crowns, not scrolls, just cloth, folded, washed, hidden. You enter a quiet storeroom tucked behind the queen's old chamber. No lock, no fanfare, just shelves of bedsheets, some frayed, some perfumed, some too fine to use, and all of them somehow stained with history. Because legacies don't live in the marble statues. They live here, in the softest things. A pillow that held the king's head after he'd whispered state secrets to a servant girl. A canopy sheet from the bed where a queen waited, hour after hour, for a husband who never came. A linen wrap hastily knotted around a maid's waist as she was sent away, pregnant with a royal heir who'd never be named. History doesn't keep those moments in its official accounts, but the cloth remembers, and sometimes so do the people. There's a folded note tucked in a pillowcase, the edge peeking out just enough for you to see. You pull it free. A single sentence. He kissed me like I mattered. No name, no date, no seal. You imagine who wrote it? Not the queen, maybe not even a mistress. Just someone who was there. For one night, for one breath. And in that moment changed everything. Not for the kingdom, but for herself. Because this is what it always comes back to, doesn't it? Not the ceremonies, the closeness. The crown didn't make someone powerful. Access did. Intimacy did. A glance across a candlelit room. A hand brushing against another in a corridor. A servant who poured too slowly. A queen who smiled too rarely. You sit now on the edge of the unused bed, hands folded in your lap. The stories swirl behind your eyes. Kings who loved, queens who endured, servants who survived, and mistresses who shaped the world by simply being where they shouldn't have been. All of it, in the linens. The scent of rosewater, the hush of footsteps, the sighs trapped between the threads. You remember that even when names are forgotten, moments are not. You remember that the palace didn't run on power alone. It ran on longing, on quiet defiance, on the kind of love that was never supposed to happen. And yet it did, again and again, until the palace walls themselves became soaked in it. And so, as the last candle flickers and the sheets grow cold, you let the images dissolve. Not quickly, but like mist. Not erased, but absorbed. Because power leaves marks, but softness leaves echoes. And the history you weren't meant to see? It's right here, tucked into linens, pressed between lips that were never supposed to meet. Written into margins of lives that were never officially allowed to matter, and yet did. Because the crown ruled the nation, but the whispers ruled the crown. So now, with the candles gone and the moon slipping behind clouds, you're still here. Quiet, still, somewhere between time and dream. You've wandered through velvet-draped rooms and perfumed secrets, through betrayals that never made the history books and touches that changed dynasties. The palace, for all its grandeur, was never really built from stone. It was built from people, from longing, from stolen glances in mirrored halls, from the weight of silence carried by queens, and the weight of secrets carried by servants. And in all those centuries of rules and rituals, one truth always remained. What happened at night, behind those heavy doors, mattered. Not because it was recorded, but because it rippled. Through love, through policy, through the shape of a kingdom, guided not by law but by feeling. Now, as you sink deeper into stillness, let those echoes fade. Let the kings rest. Let the queens stop pretending. Let the servants finally exhale. You don't need to remember every name. You only need to know they were here, just like you. Full of hope and hurt and little rebellions. Close your eyes now. Let the last notes of that quiet court music drift away like smoke. Let the palace grow soft and blurred behind you, like a memory you visited once in a dream. Because it's night, And in history, as in dreams, the best parts always happen after the record books close. If you've made it all the way to the end, leave a comment and tell me what story you'd like to hear next. I genuinely enjoy seeing and reading every kind word you share. Thank you for watching. Sweet dreams and good night.